Good morning.
I'll be right back. using this computer and I was adding something to your readings, kind of for fun. I went back and took another look at Aaron Burr. We talked about Aaron Burr, right, last time? We talked about him and his little plot to go down south in the treason trial.
No.
We haven't got that far? What's the last thing you've got in your notes?
Midnight Judges.
The Midnight Judges, okay. So one of the problems is I always review the recordings of the class to make sure where we were, and the recordings didn't show up this morning, so I think they're up there now. Let's take a peek. Wait a minute, I don't have the URL for it, so forget about it. Let's just go away. This thing to go away. So Midnight Judges, huh? Okay, then we'll. So we really haven't done much in the way of Thomas Jefferson at all, except as vice president. So let's get into Thomas Jefferson and that sort of thing. And I'm going to open up a PowerPoint. I think it's in Unit 6. It's called The Republican Republic. If I can. It probably won't make much difference to you guys, but I edited it a little bit so it looks a little different than it looks on the one that you have, but we'll get there anyway. The first slide is the last days of Adams. He manages to alienate both parties. What do I mean? He makes both his own faction, the Federalists, angry at him because he won't go to war with France. He makes the anti-Federalists, we'll start calling them the Democratic Republicans, angry at him because of the Alien and Sedition Acts. Did I introduce the resolutions that Jefferson and Madison wrote to complain about the Alien and Sedition Acts? Let's look at them anyway. Won't hurt to look at them even if we have talked about them. There are the acts. I had a different slide on that, but anyway. After those acts went out, the Alien Act, the Alien Enemies Act, both went out on the same day, the 24th of June, 1798. The Sedition Act, did we talk about that? And the fact that it kind of looked like it was limiting your First Amendment rights. That came out in July. And then also, before all of that, on about the 14th of June, had passed a Naturalization Act, which made it much harder to get your citizenship. Normally, how many years? Does anybody know? How many years does it take to get your citizenship? 5 years. They made it 14 years. Why would they do that? Any thoughts? What are they up to? I mean, they say this is all for national security to keep the French Revolution from spreading to our country, but what are they really doing? What do you think they're doing? If you're a politician, what do you think they're doing? It's a Federalist president, and what he's trying to do is limit new support for the Democratic Republicans. He's trying to keep the other group from growing, and he figures that French people coming over are all going to be friends of Thomas Jefferson, and he doesn't want them voting for him anytime soon. So they passed this Naturalization Act that makes it harder to get your citizenship. Now, as a political way of protesting this, they weren't planning a revolution or anything, but it's just a political way of protesting this. Jefferson and Madison put their heads together, and they decide to get a couple of the states to protest, to issue resolutions protesting the Alien and Sedition Act. Jefferson figures it's got to be 2 states, so he tells Madison, you take care of Virginia. I've got some friends in the legislature in Kentucky. I'll take care of Kentucky. And we'll get them to vote for and pass resolutions against the alien and protesting against these acts that we don't like. And they'll do that in November and December of 1798. Jefferson comes out with the Kentucky Resolution first. Then Madison comes out with the Virginia Resolution. And they're going to talk about limits of federal authority. And they're going to talk about a word that they call interposition. It's on this slide there. And the idea of interposition is that, well, the general concept is the whole thing about our government, our Constitution, it's a deal amongst sovereign states. They've all agreed to this deal. So they're all equal partners. So if the federal government kind of overdoes something, partners to this agreement have the right to get together and block it. And they call that interposition. So this would be, several states rising up and saying, no, we won't put up with that law, or whatever, and they could block it. The following year, somebody writes a second Kentucky Resolution, which is passed by their assembly. The Little Golden Book of History suggests that Jefferson wrote it, but I don't think he wrote it. And the language is different from his typical language. And this one introduces another term. And the term it introduces is nullification. And the idea of nullification is that any one state, any one of the partners in this agreement that we call the Constitution, has the right, if they decide a law is unfair to them, to nullify that law, to make it null and void, at least within their own state. So let's say the federal government passes an unfair tax that only hurts Kentucky, so Kentucky's going to nullify the law so they don't pay the tax in their state. Something like that. That's just an example. Once again, they weren't really planning to do anything. They were just trying to make a point that we were really angry, that these states were really angry about the Alien and Sedition Acts. Later on, this word nullification, they're going to regret that they raised this word because it's going to cause some big trouble several presidencies down the line, when Andrew Jackson is president, in fact. We're going to have an election, of course. And I put Republicans on here. I should fix that. I should say Democratic Republicans, so you don't confuse it with the modern day Republicans. They put up Thomas Jefferson for president, Aaron Burr for vice president. The Federalists are, of course, going to back John Adams, the sitting president, for re-election, and Charles Pinckney for vice president. But a funny thing's going to happen in this election. Now, Adams has made his own Federalists angry with him about not going to war with France. He's made the anti-Federalists, or the Democratic Republicans, if you want to call them that, angry with him because of the Alien and Sedition Acts and similar things like that. And by the way, in the Sedition Act, in the case of the Sedition Acts, they've actually put people in jail for saying bad things about the government. So he's losing votes. And when the electoral votes are counted, Adams gets 65, Pinckney gets 64, they're out of it, because Jefferson gets 73. The problem is Burr gets 73 too. Now, the normal arrangement is, if you want one guy to be president and one guy to be vice president, then you would arrange to make sure that the guy who wanted to be vice president would get one less vote. Somebody messed it up. We don't know for sure who. I don't think Aaron Burr did it, at least not to start with. But because it's a tie vote, it went to the House of Representatives to break the tie. And they vote 35 different ballots, and they can't break the tie. And then Aaron Burr gets the idea, all I need is to win one more state, get one more vote, and I could be president. So he's going to start maneuvering around, trying to get someone to change their vote. Vote one less for Jefferson or whatever. But at the same time, Alexander Hamilton comes out of the woodwork, and he starts a smear campaign against Burr. He and some of his friends, and there was all sorts of bad stuff out. Burr got smeared because he was having a political fight with other Democratic Republicans in New York. And they were cooking up all sorts of evil stories about him. Most of them were false. One or two of them were kind of true. And Jefferson's guys or not Jefferson's guys, but Hamilton's people are going to borrow all these things and start smearing Burr. And the outcome of it is, when they vote the 36th time, Jefferson's going to win 10 states. He only needed to win 9. And he's going to become president. And Burr will become vice president. And Burr's going to be bitter because he realizes that one of the reasons this happened is because of the mouth of Alexander Hamilton. And of course we know eventually they're going to come to blows. Not yet. After this is all over, unfortunately for John Adams, he solves the quasi-war with France. What he does is he finally realizes that his own cabinet is not helping him, so he fires them. He fires the Secretary of State, fires the Secretary of War, and decides to take more direct control over things. He calls Pinckney back, he calls all these guys back from France, and he sends a new man out who has a lot of experience and is a pretty smart cookie. His name is William Vans Murray, and this guy makes it all the way to Napoleon. And Napoleon Bonaparte has just gotten in control of France. So the French Revolution's over with, and Bonaparte looks like he's going to be the boss. And William Vans Murray gets to him. Talleyrand, he avoids Talleyrand. And he gets to Napoleon, and he tells Napoleon, we're supposed to be friends. Why are you guys out there capturing our ships? Can't you stop this? And Napoleon, who's busy with a lot of other things in his own country and also fighting other countries, says, yeah, no problem. And so he declares, we will end that. So William Vans Murray reports back to Adams, we've done it. It's fixed. If Adams had only done it before the election, he probably would have got elected. But Adams wasn't doing it to get elected. Adams was doing it because he thought that was his job. He wasn't much of a political mind. He was a smart man, but he didn't care about politics. He cared about doing what he thought was right. So he loses the election. The election, took place as it always does in November of 1800. So who was the president in January of 1801? Did we ask this question last class? It was John Adams who was still president. Because back then, the president didn't take office, a new president didn't take office until, I keep taking these glasses off because they're my reading glasses and you're a blur either way I look at you, with the glasses or not. New presidents won't take office until the 4th of March. Adams isn't finished. This is when he's going to do what we call the midnight judges. The Federalists, realizing they're out of the executive branch, pretty much, and they'll probably be a minority in the Congress, they're looking for a new place to camp out, and they decide to get into the judiciary business. And they passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, setting up 16 new circuit courts, appointing 16 new judges, and of course, the Senate are the ones that have to give advice and consent on appointments, and they're all Federalists, or mainly Federalists, so they do that. So we end up with 16 new Federalist judges. Lots of other Federalists get jobs as attorneys court attorneys, clerks, marshals, things like that. He also appoints John Marshall, a Virginian, but he's a Federalist, as Chief Justice of the United States, and sets up 42 justices of the peace in the District of Columbia. They're not like really a judge. A JP is something a little bit less than a judge. I don't know if you guys have ever had the opportunity, but JPs can marry you and things like that, but they can't do a serious criminal court case or anything. Thomas Jefferson's furious because it seems like the Federalists are all hiding out in the judicial branch now. And he can't do anything about it because he's not president yet. But he makes himself the promise that when he gets to be president, he's going to fix that. There's a problem with that. He can't fire any of the judges unless they misbehave, because a federal judge is a federal judge for all of his life unless he does something wrong. Anyway, that's North America. That red arrow is pointing at something. Remember, after 1763, France was kicked out of North America, but Napoleon Bonaparte in 1801, he's going to lean on Spain really hard, and he's going to buy, quote marks on both sides of that word, he's going to buy the Louisiana Territory from Spain, including New Orleans. Basically, it's all the territory west of the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. West of that still belongs to Spain. South of that still belongs to Spain. Spain still owns Florida. Napoleon doesn't actually send anybody over there. He's busy fighting wars in Europe. Now, that's going to cause a complication. We've already added Kentucky and Tennessee. We're about to add Ohio to the Union. Our economy is still based on agriculture. We are doing a lot of shipping, a lot of trade, overseas trade. It's growing. Most of our big cities have to do with foreign trade. And most of the big cities don't have anything to do with the farm country, which is the main income of our country. It's kind of strange. Down south, there are no big cities. The biggest city down south is probably Charleston. And it's not very big, maybe 20,000 people, maybe 30,000. New Orleans, of course, doesn't belong to us. Otherwise, it would be the largest city. We're just starting to industrialize up in New England because they have the fast-moving water. We don't industrialize in the South very well. There's Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States. He was a lawyer, an architect, an engineer, an inventor. He designed his own house. The main writer of the Declaration of Independence, although he had help from Benjamin Franklin and I think Robert Livingston too. He's one of the people that founded the University of Virginia. He'd been an ambassador in France. He was our first Secretary of State under the Constitution, under George Washington, but he quit in 1793 because he didn't agree with Washington on foreign policy. And of course he'll be Vice President to John Adams by that fluke where Hamilton messed around with the vote and then ended up getting Jefferson the Vice President spot instead of the Federalist guy. There's his cabinet, kind of interesting. You can see right up at the top, Vice President. Aaron Burr only serves as Vice President for one term of office. He'll be gone. We'll talk about that problem. Secretary of State, all the way through all 8 years of Jefferson's presidency, will be James Madison. He appoints a guy named Samuel Dexter to be Secretary of the Treasury, but Dexter kicks off before he has a chance to serve. So then they appoint a young guy born in Switzerland who's got a really, really good mind about economy and that sort of thing. They make him Secretary of the Treasury. His name is Albert Gallatin. I'll show you a picture of him in a minute, etc. That's Gallatin in the middle of that bunch of mugshots there. He looks a little bit like Yoda to me. If you look at him, he's the most successful Secretary of the Treasury in the history of the United States. He served longer than any other Secretary of Treasury in our history, 13 years. So he served under 3 presidents and part of a 4th one, just a little bit. Secretary of State James Madison, father of the Constitution, had a lot to do with the writing of the Bill of Rights. He also contributed to the Federalist Papers, even though he's basically an anti-federalist. He was part of that compromise of 1790 when the capital city was designated to be on the banks of the Potomac, down in between Maryland and Virginia. He's also involved in the Marbury versus Madison case, which we haven't discussed yet, and also the Louisiana Purchase, and eventually he'll become the 4th president of the United States. Governor James Monroe will be the last president of the United States who actually fought in the American Revolution. He was involved in the battle for New York, the Battle of Trenton. He was our ambassador to France under Washington. Washington fired him right at the end of his presidency because he didn't think he was firm enough with the French. The French loved James Monroe, even more than they loved Jefferson. And Washington didn't really like that because he wanted Monroe to be kind of strong to keep the French in line. He's a good friend of Thomas Paine, the writer of Common Sense and The Crisis. He's a good friend of the Marquis de Lafayette. He served as governor of Virginia twice, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and eventually the 5th President of the United States. We'll get there eventually. There's Albert Gallatin. He was in favor of the National Bank, which is interesting because Jefferson hated the National Bank. When the National Bank comes up for a new charter, he'll support that. When we get to the War of 1812, he'll be the guy that arranges the money to finance our government during that time. He's a man that favors moderation in all things. He served in the Senate before all of this very briefly. He was actually, I think, too young and got kicked back out, but he served in the Senate for a while. He was the last surviving man to be in the U.S. Senate in the 1700s. Meriwether Lewis is going to become Jefferson's secretary. You might call him chief of staff nowadays. He's pretty young, though. He's a young captain, army captain. He'd been involved in the Whiskey Rebellion, going and putting that rebellion down with Daniel Morgan. Jefferson hires Meriwether Lewis. He tells him what his general job is, which is to sit at a desk at the front of the house and greet visitors and sort out my calendar and things like that. But he says, but what I really want you to concentrate is do research on the West. I'm talking about way west, west of the Mississippi. Figure out what it would take if you wanted to go look at all that land. How do you go about doing it? Figure out how many people you would need, what kind of equipment you would need, how much you think it would cost, all of that. Think about that. Exactly why, we don't know yet. Of course, he'll be part of Lewis and Clark. Robert Livingston will be Jefferson's ambassador in France, but early on he was one of the drafters of the Declaration of Independence. He was the Chancellor of New York. He was the U.S. Secretary of Foreign Affairs under the Articles of Confederation. He administered the presidential oath to George Washington when he got elected the first time. He was our ambassador to France. He was involved with the Louisiana Purchase and other things. What's Jefferson's philosophy? Jefferson was a man of contradictions. He didn't like big crowds. He wanted America to be a land of small landholders. A country of small landholders. What am I talking about? Everybody had his little piece of the action. He didn't like big crowds. He didn't like places that were densely populated. He was afraid of crowds, I think. And yet, he did like technology and industry. How can you have technology and industry if you don't have concentrated population? He was afraid of international entanglement, just like George Washington was. He was very interested in the land to the west, but on the other hand, as an anti-federalist, he didn't believe that the government had the power to acquire land. There's the dichotomy, you know. He wanted the government to be minimal. He got rid of the Army. He almost got rid of the Navy. And yet, he's the guy that sends the Navy over to fight the Barbary pirates eventually. He opposed slavery, and yet he owned slaves. Kind of a conflicted person. He didn't like dress up. He didn't like big formal occasions. He didn't like standing in front of Congress and making speeches. His voice wasn't very good for it, for one reason. But he could write to Congress. He was an eloquent writer. He understood politics. I wouldn't call him a professional politician, but I would say that he understood how politics worked. And he realized that if he was going to be successful, he had to cooperate with the Congress. He wasn't a dictator or anything like that. He had to figure out how to manipulate or get along with Congress. Domestically, two big issues that he's going to deal with right away. In fact, he's promising himself, when I get to be president, I'm getting rid of the National Bank. I don't like the National Bank. Remember, they had that debate with Alexander Hamilton when Washington was president. He also wanted to deal with this thing that Adams did, sticking all these Federalists into the court system. Want to figure out how to get them out of the court system. Now, on the National Bank issue, his own Secretary of the Treasury, when he says, hey, how do we get rid of the National Bank? And Albert Gallatin says, Mr. President, I really wish you wouldn't do that. We need the National Bank to develop our country. We need the National Bank for monetary stability. If you get rid of the National Bank, we don't have that. And to his credit, Jefferson listened to him because he knew he was a smart man. He listened to him, and he left the National Bank alone. He wasn't one of its biggest fans, but he left them alone. So he's going to focus his energies early on trying to do something about the judiciary and that Midnight Judges Judiciary Act of 1801. What he wants to do is try and get rid of the judges, but he can't, right? Because they serve for the duration of good behavior. They serve for life. And that Judiciary Act of 1801, it appointed 16 brand new judges, and he can't get rid of them. He does get another Judiciary Act passed that gets rid of all those new courts, but he can't fire the judges. And he can't get rid of the new Chief Justice of the United States. And when he tries to go after these judges and get them impeached or whatever, the Federalists are going to scream bloody murder that you're violating constitutional rights. And some people in his own party are going to agree with that. They're going to damage the courts. One of his first court cases that he's going to meet up with is Marbury versus Madison, 1803. Mr. Marbury, Madison, of course, referring to the Secretary of State. It's a lawsuit. Mr. Marbury had been awarded the position of Justice of the Peace in Washington, D.C. And to do that job, you have to have a commission. And President Adams, before he left office, had signed the commission and given it to the Secretary of State to have it given to Mr. Marbury. But the Secretary of State didn't get it delivered. So it's sitting on his desk when James Madison takes over as Secretary of State. And Mr. Marbury asked Mr. Madison, please give me my commission. And Mr. Madison says, commission? What commission? I guess I'll have to look for it. I don't know where it is. And that commission kept finding its way to the bottom of the pile of papers on Madison's desk. He didn't want to give this Federalist a commission. So finally, Marbury was going to sue the Secretary of State. And he's going to ask the Supreme Court to issue a writ of what they call mandamus, which basically means you must, or we force you, to force the Secretary of State to give this man his commission. It's a John Marshall court. The Chief Justice is a Federalist, so Mr. Marbury figures he's going to win this one. But he's shocked because when the Supreme Court rules, their ruling doesn't sound like that. What their ruling says is, yes, Mr. Marbury, you and all, if you know, in a fair world, you deserve that commission. It's already signed. You should have the job. But the Supreme Court can't tell the executive branch of the government how to do their job. And Mr. Marbury's side argues, wait a minute, the Judicial Act of 1789, the very first one we passed, said that the court could do just that. And the Marshall Court said, then that was wrong, because that's contrary to the meaning of the Constitution. And so they declared the 13th section of the Judiciary Act of 1789 to be unconstitutional. So it's a victory for Jefferson and Madison in one respect. But in the other respect, not so, because now they've established a precedent that the Supreme Court has the right to rule on federal law and declare whether it's, according to their interpretation of the Constitution, is constitutional or not. This sets a pattern for the Supreme Court forever, right up to today. So it's the most important precedent in the history of the Supreme Court. And it gives the Supreme Court a lot more power than some people thought it might have. And John Marshall, by the way, is going to be around for a long, long time. He doesn't die until Andrew Jackson's president. So that's the most important precedent, and they call that, what they call that power is judicial review, or judicial review of federal law. They can't say how the law has to read or anything. All they can say is this law is constitutional or this law is not constitutional. And by declaring it unconstitutional, it makes it null and void. In the case of that Judiciary Act, it just got rid of Article 13. It didn't get rid of the whole act. Marbury versus Madison. What else? Jefferson's going to succeed in cutting federal debt. He's also going to eliminate taxes. He's going to cut the military back to nothing. You have to understand, the Democratic Republicans were afraid of the military because the military used to be George Washington's baby, and so they tended to be Federalists. And the Democratic Republicans, even before the election, they were afraid that the Army might get in their way. So they are more than happy to cut the Army to ribbons. And they did so. They thought that removed any threat to their government. Now, he didn't get rid of all the Federalists out of the government. He did what Washington did, or he tried to. If you could do your job, you kept your job. If you couldn't do it, then you got kicked out, but it didn't matter whether you were of the Federalist persuasion or of the Democratic Republican persuasion. A lot of Federalists retired anyway. They saw the writing on the wall. The Democratic Republicans are in charge. But some, if they really wanted to keep their jobs, they just switched over. It's kind of like Lubbock, right? If we ever have an election, you drive down the road and tell me what all the election posters say. Maybe 1 out of 100 says Democrat, right? All the rest say, I'm a Republican, I'm a conservative. People figured out, you know, that if you want to get elected, you got to be a Republican and a conservative. Whether they really are or not, it's a different story. So it got rid of the federal debt, got rid of the whiskey tax, got rid of other excise taxes. Ohio comes into the Union. And he decides that instead of an army, we'll just use militia if we have to defend ourselves. He cuts the Navy back too. Remember, during Washington's presidency, the Naval Act of 1794 authorized construction of some warships. And they got a few of them built. And now Jefferson's going to shut it down. So some of them are kind of halfway built, and now there's no more money. Also in 1808, as was agreed when they wrote the Constitution, they're going to take some action on slavery. They're going to ban slave trade. You can't import slaves anymore. That doesn't outlaw slavery. It doesn't mean you can't sell slaves inside the country. This bans international slave trade. The British also did the same thing about a year before we did it. This thing about the federal court system, Jefferson's really angry about it, but within the Democratic Republicans, there were two views on this. One view, the more moderate people, who normally would tend to support Jefferson, they felt if you keep attacking the courts, you're going to destroy the judiciary system, which will harm our government. Others agreed with the attack. He's going to try and impeach some judges, and he's going to actually get one impeached. One of the things, a couple of things that happened in connection with slavery, we had the rebellion in Haiti when the slaves rose up and kicked the French out. That's the first, in modern times anyway, the first successful slave rebellion. Boy, did the southern people in the United States, they were really, really worried about their slaves hearing about that. That was a no-no. You didn't talk about that. But there was an attempt at a rebellion, or a suggested rebellion, just before Jefferson got elected, called Gabriel's Rebellion, in which a pretty well-educated and skilled slave who had some money because of his skills almost started some kind of a slave protest. When I read about it, it doesn't look like they were planning violence. It looks like they were planning on doing a march on the capital city, on Richmond, to beg the governor to make things better for slaves. We'll never know, because before it ever happened, someone got scared and told his master, and it was all over, and they rounded up about 25 of these guys, tried them, convicted them, and hanged them. They actually tried more than 25. Some of them were acquitted, believe it or not. That was Gabriel's Rebellion. One result of Gabriel's Rebellion, it made people in Virginia afraid of slave uprisings, and they start passing more laws to control slaves. Believe it or not, a lot of people that owned slaves, they'd go hunting, the slave would be carrying their gun for them. They made that illegal. They made it illegal to send your slave off somewhere on his own, unaccompanied. That's what Gabriel did. Gabriel was a blacksmith. He could read and write, and he was so good at it, and his boss didn't have that much work for him to do, so he would rent him out to other farms. And his boss didn't want to have to go with him every time, so he just said, go over to so-and-so's farm, and he's got some work for you. And Gabriel would go do the work, and the farmer would give him some money to take back to the master, but he'd also give him some money on the side. Say, this is for you, Gabriel. And so he accumulated a little bit of cash, which meant, since money talks, he could go have a beer on the way home. And he met people. He met people who knew about the Haitian Rebellion. He met African people of African origin who were ship's crew members, who were free men. And he learned a lot. That's where the ideas came from for this uprising to go talk to the governor about the situation of slaves. He died as a result of that. The impeachments, the attacks on the judges. He's going to go after, they're going to actually impeach one federal judge, a guy named John Pickering. They had a good reason to get him out of office. He was a drunk, and he was ever so slightly insane. So it wasn't too hard to kick him out. But even some of the Democratic Republicans start getting afraid, we can't go around doing this now. We're going to weaken the court system. But Jefferson wanted to go after people, and he went after a justice on the Supreme Court, an associate justice named Samuel Chase. He got him impeached, but when they put him on trial in the Senate, Jefferson's own Democratic Republicans refused to convict him. They said, "You're going too far, Mr. President." So Jefferson backed down. In terms of law, we also got a couple of new amendments. We'd had the first 10, right? That was the Bill of Rights. Then they passed the 11th Amendment, and it has to do with the technicality of a person who lives in one state suing another state. They made that illegal. You had to get judicial relief a different way. And the 12th Amendment sorted out the voting for president and vice president. It made it so that you voted for each one of those on separate ballots. So you didn't have the confusion you had in 1800 when Jefferson was elected. One of the things that started growing up, some of these factions started looking a little bit like political parties. The Federalists, it was more or less a faction, but there was one group of Federalists up in Massachusetts who were really far out. They were really extreme Federalists, very angry that their faction was getting weaker, very angry that there were so many men from Virginia who were presidents of the United States. They organized a little club. It was called the Essex Junto. One of the founders was Timothy Pickering. He'd been the Secretary of State under Washington, and then under Adams. He was the guy that Adams fired when he kind of got control of his cabinet. They're pretty influential people. Lawyers, merchants, politicians. They liked Alexander Hamilton's economic policies. At one point, they're actually going to ask Hamilton, "Why don't you join our group? That way you'll bring New York into the group with you." And Hamilton looked at it, thought about it, and said, "Nah, I don't like where you're going with this." Then they went after Aaron Burr by the time he became vice president. And Aaron Burr really didn't want to have anything to do with him either. He was a Democratic Republican. Why would he mess around with Federalists? Eventually, some of them come up with the idea of seceding from the Union and joining Canada. Burr was never involved with this, although if you read some books, people will insist he was. We'll talk about him in a minute. In the Democratic Republican Party, you've got a bunch of guys that call themselves the Old Republicans. They say Jefferson's sliding too far into the middle. He's a pragmatist, dirty word with them. All a pragmatist was a guy that said, if it works, then do it. You know, there's no ideals involved. If it works, then it's good. They didn't like that. They hated a really strong presidency. They hated a really strong federal government. They didn't like the idea of a professional army. They didn't like taxation at all. John Randolph was one. John Taylor was one. Both of them were Virginians. You notice on the slide here it says John Taylor of Caroline. There were several John Taylors. And the way you differentiated was what county he came from. That's why they have the name like that. Some international problems that Jefferson's going to meet up with. One of the first ones is pirate attacks on our ships that are trying to do business in the Mediterranean. Back when we belonged to England, the English Navy, the Royal Navy protected us, but now they don't. And they've taken some of our ships. So Jefferson, kind of offhandedly, without really thinking it over carefully, sent some Navy ships over there and said, clean out the pirates. One of them was a frigate called the Philadelphia, and the Philadelphia was chasing a pirate ship that came out of the town of Tripoli, and they ran up on rocks. And the ship couldn't get off the rocks, and they tried throwing guns overboard and stuff overboard, and they couldn't get it off the rocks. And because they couldn't get off the rocks, the Tripolitans just rode their galleys out there and overwhelmed them by numbers. Captured all of the American crew, held them for ransom, then set about trying to figure out how to refloat that ship. Eventually they'll get it refloated, and they'll tow it into Tripoli harbor, and they'll try and fix it so they can use it for their own purposes. That all happened in 1803, I think about October. I don't know if I have the dates on here or not. Yeah, I do, on this map. USS Philadelphia was captured on the 31st of October. On the 16th of February the next year, a small American squadron goes into the Mediterranean. They look for the Philadelphia. They notice it's not on the rocks anymore. It's docked in Tripoli harbor, where the Tripolitans are trying to repair it. And a brave young naval officer named Stephen Decatur gets a group of volunteers, and in the cover of darkness they row longboat into the harbor, which is very dangerous. I mean, it was guarded with cannons and guns. They boarded that ship, they threw the Tripolitans off the ship, and they burned it so that they couldn't use the ship for their own purposes. But that's not satisfying. I mean, that doesn't satisfy our needs. Now, the Pasha of Tripoli in 1801, way back then, he showed his disdain for the Americans by walking into the American consulate and cutting down the American flag, throwing it on the ground. So we really didn't like him. Then he's got that ship in 1803. And one of our agents over in the Middle East was a guy named Eaton. I think he used to be a naval officer or an army officer, William Eaton. And he came up with an idea of how to settle the hash of the Pasha of Tripoli. The Pasha of Tripoli had an older brother who should have been on the throne, but he chased him off. And his older brother was living out in the desert with his men, Hamid or Hamish, depending on whose spelling you agree with. And William Eaton suggested, if we give that man some weapons, if we give him some money, and if we promise to use naval guns to support him, he could capture the city of Derna, and then, if he's successful with that, he could go capture the city of Tripoli and kick his younger brother out. And the powers that be in America think, good idea. So a commodore named Preble, can't remember his first name, sails in with a small group of ships. That one young officer, Decatur, was with him, but he had some Marines on board, not a lot. One young Marine lieutenant named Presley O'Bannon. And they're going to put William Eaton and Presley O'Bannon and 8 Marines, that's a giant force, isn't it? 8 Marines ashore, and they're going to go find this guy out in the desert, promise him support, encourage him to organize his men and attack Derna. And they're going to do just that. They're going to capture Derna on the 27th of April, 1805. By this time, by the way, Jefferson's been reelected. He was reelected in 1804. And they're planning to go all the way to Tripoli and finish the job when an American diplomat who had been kind of left out of the picture named Tobias Lear opens a negotiation with the Pasha of Tripoli, and we don't get the job finished because the Pasha agrees to behave himself, and so we sign an agreement with him. That leaves Hamid and Lieutenant O'Bannon and William Eaton kind of out there hanging. So they call off the rest of their operation. Hamid's grateful to the Americans. He's grateful to the Marines. Only 8 of them, but they showed some of the other people how to fight against the people in the fort. They give Lieutenant O'Bannon a sword, a picture of a sword, kind of like it there. The hilt of the sword was covered with precious stones. It was incredibly valuable. Lieutenant O'Bannon, of course, couldn't accept it as a personal gift from a foreigner. So he turned it into the U.S. government. They put it in storage in Washington, D.C. Someone stole all the jewels off the sword. Typical Washington, D.C. You know, they even had thieves in Washington back then. A lot of them sit in the House of Congress, I'm afraid. But that sword, that hilt, is called the Mamluk hilt. And the United States Marine Corps adopted that sword for use by its officers. It's the only military branch that uses that hilt, that kind of hilt. I've got one hanging on my wall. My father has one on his wall, or had one. So that's a new tradition established in the Marine Corps. But we settled for time being the problem with the Barbary pirates at any rate. We didn't have to go back and do it again. It won't last forever. Let's talk about Louisiana. We'll go back and talk about Indians later. In Louisiana Territory is everything kind of west of the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. I mentioned that before. Now the French own it. We were very concerned. Napoleon has now captured Spain. He owns Spain. He's captured Austria, I think, by this time, or part of it anyway. In 1802, he sends 20,000 soldiers over to the island of Haiti to put down the slave rebellion, which started way back in the 1790s. They fail. They fail because of the nature of Haiti, and also they fail because most of the soldiers came down with yellow fever. And so they returned to France. But everyone in America, especially in the leadership, they're asking themselves, why 20,000 men? You need 20,000 men for a small slave rebellion in Haiti. Why 20,000 men? And they drew the immediate conclusion that they weren't going to stop at Haiti. They were going to New Orleans. After all, it belonged to them. They were going to occupy New Orleans and start occupying the rest of the Louisiana Territory that they'd taken away from Spain. And Jefferson and Madison didn't like that idea at all. They particularly didn't want the French in charge of New Orleans because that made it possible for them to block off the Mississippi River. So Jefferson's going to authorize the American ambassador in France to offer Napoleon $13 million or so to buy the city of New Orleans, to keep the French from occupying it. Livingston has trouble getting in to see Napoleon, so Jefferson sends James Monroe, who's a big favorite with the French people. And the two of them get in contact with Napoleon. And Napoleon's the chief of his treasury, and they're saying, we want to buy New Orleans. And Napoleon tells his treasurer, says, I don't have time for this. Tell them they can have the whole mess. Tell them they can have all of Louisiana Territory. I don't have time to worry about it. And I don't have troops to send over there. And so they make that offer, and the deal is struck to buy Louisiana Territory for $15 million. If, of course, the President of the United States agrees to it. And they go back and report to President Jefferson. He really wants the land, but he's an anti-federalist, and he really realizes that Democratic, Republicans, anti-federalists aren't allowed to do things the Constitution doesn't say they can do. But he wants the land, and it finally gets the best of him. Now he's got to persuade his own party to buy it, and about a third of his party, the group they call the Tertium Quid, they're hardline anti-federalists, and they say, no, 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 you can't do that. And the Essex Junto and the Federalists, they say, no, 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 you can't do that. They don't want him to buy it because they don't want our country to expand to the west and take labor away from the east. They need the labor. So Jefferson very astutely goes to the Democratic Republicans who are more moderate, who agree with him, and goes to the more moderate Federalists, and he assembles kind of a coalition that have enough votes to push it through Congress. And he gets authorization in April of 1803, and by the end of the year, it's a done deal. And we have bought the Louisiana Territory. What do we get? Well, we got this land in theory, but nobody was living on it. So how could you say it was anybody's property? So basically, what we really bought was the exclusive right to try and take it away from the Indians. The French are out of the picture, the Spanish are out of the picture, at least as far as the Rocky Mountains. Nevertheless, it was a giant purchase. And almost immediately, Jefferson's going to dispatch Meriwether Lewis and a fellow named John Clark, who gets promoted up to captain, so he's equal with Lewis. And the two of them, Lewis is pretty young. Some people thought he was too young. So the two of those guys are going to run an expedition. It's not a very large expedition, and they're going to go out as far as the Rocky Mountains, if possible, over the Rocky Mountains, and see if they can get all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They're going to take a 2-year trip. They're going to go all the way to the Pacific and back over the Rockies and back to Washington. On the way, they're making copious notes about plant life, animal life, people that they meet, possible routes where you could have roads, where you could grow crops, is the river navigable, that sort of thing. They go up the Missouri River, remember that. They go up the Missouri River, almost all the way to the Rockies. They go over the Rockies. Now on the way up there, I'm trying to remember roughly where, maybe somewhere around where St. Louis is. They picked up a translator. He's a French trapper who could speak good English, and he could speak a lot of Indian dialect. And he was married to an Indian woman. She was ever so slightly pregnant. She was a very young one. She was about 16. Her name was Sacagawea. She and her husband will translate for them all the way, but her real importance to Lewis and Clark was that she was a good ambassador, in a way. She could negotiate with people, and then when they met these different groups of Indians, she managed to explain to them that this group offered them no threat, and persuade the Indians to help them out along their way. So she was able to negotiate things like the purchase of horses on part of the trip, and a place to store some of their equipment, because when they got far enough up the Missouri, when their boats, they had collapsible boats, but they could only go so far, and they found a place to drop them off, leave them with the Indians, and continued on over the mountains, down the Columbia River, and all the way to the coast of the Pacific Ocean. When they get back, both of them, Lewis and Clark, both are going to write reports on the trip with all the details, and drawings of the people that they meet, and plant life and animal life, all of that. Jefferson's fascinated by this. He's going to send out another military man. His name is Zebulon Pike. He's going to send him out further south. He's going to go to where southern Colorado is. They named Pikes Peak after him, in fact. He's then going to circle around to the south. He's going to have a problem because he's going to run into Spanish territory and he's going to be captured by the Spanish authorities. Because he has all these papers from the president, they're not going to kill him, which they tend to do to people that invade, but they're going to escort him all the way across their territory back to the Mississippi, put him on a boat, send him across the Mississippi, and say, don't come back, please. But Pike's expedition was very successful because all the way back, they went through all these different Spanish outposts and forts and things like that, so he could take notes about them. Then the president will send one more group looking for the headwaters of the Red River, because from reports that Pike gave them about the Red River, they think maybe that would be a route to help you get all the way to Santa Fe, the Spanish town out in Nuevo Mexico. They're not going to have any luck finding the headwaters of the Red River. But 3 different expeditions go out. That's what it looks like. That's what we got. Nowadays, it includes the states of Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, etc., etc. We're going to divide the territory up. The very southernmost part, down near where the borders of Arkansas are and what modern-day Louisiana, that will be one territory. They call that Orleans. The north of that will be called Louisiana Territory. The people that live there, most of them are Spanish, some French speakers. At first, Jefferson just makes them kind of like a captive territory. Nobody has any rights. But eventually, these people will become American citizens. They'll be governed all the way from Washington for a while. Then finally, he'll set up people to be in control of that area and start subdividing it a little bit. Meriwether Lewis will be the governor of part of that area for a while. All of this, all of what Jefferson's doing, is totally different from what the Democratic-Republican tendency is. He's going past the authorities that they agree to. There's a picture of Sacagawea showing Lewis and Clark. I'm sure she didn't look like that, but she was really, really young. She was a slave. She was an Indian slave, by the way. She'd been captured by a tribe. She was a Shoshone girl. And she'd been kidnapped by another tribe and taken back towards the east and sold to this French trapper. He married her, and then she ends up guiding Lewis and Clark along with her husband. There's their route up the Missouri River. Eventually it's going to go up across the Yellowstone River on the other side of the Continental Divide and down the Columbia River to the ocean. Election of 1804, Jefferson and Pinckney are going to run. Well, 1804 is a little different. Jefferson's going to run against Pinckney, who's one of the last of the Federalists. Jefferson won't have Aaron Burr as his vice presidential candidate. Something's happened with Aaron Burr and he's out of the picture. We'll talk about that in a minute. Pinckney barely gets any votes at all. He's the brother of Thomas Pinckney. I don't know why I have those expeditions there. One other domestic thing that happened that we should talk about, and that's the Yazoo land fraud. I don't know if you remember, but when we talked about the Articles of Confederation, we mentioned that Maryland held up signing the Articles because a lot of states were claiming Western lands. And I said all of them gave up those claims except for Georgia. And here it is, 1802, Jefferson's the president, and Georgia suddenly gives up their land claims and says, oh, that belongs to the federal government. The problem is that land's already been sold and probably sold 2 or 3 times. So there's people living there that have spent a major portion of their life living there, that have farms and things like that, and suddenly they're told they don't own their land. And it causes a crisis, and Jefferson, being pragmatic, says, I can fix this. What we'll do is we'll arrange for all those people to be paid for the land, or if they want to stay there, allow them to buy the land from the government. The first people to complain about that are his own tertium quid guys, the guys from the extremist Democratic Republicans. They gripe about it and say it's not legal, the president doesn't have the right to do that, we don't want to give away money to these people. There's even a law in Georgia that says you can't do that. After Jefferson leaves office in 1810, this is going to get all the way up to the Supreme Court. There will be a court case called Fletcher versus Peck. And the Marshall Court upholds the president's settlement of this problem. And in doing that, they establish another precedent. In this case, the Supreme Court can nullify unconstitutional state laws, not just federal laws. But that's about all the domestic things that Jefferson's going to have to meet with. There's a lot of foreign problems. Let's talk about one last thing, and then we'll get into foreign affairs. I'm going to introduce this to you. We won't finish it in the time we've got left. Aaron Burr became vice president in 1801 when Jefferson became president. He was locked in a personal conflict with other Democratic Republicans in New York State. The Federalists kind of watched it from a distance and thought it was funny. Governor Clinton and his family were very powerful in New York. Burr was independent of them. They had a power fight. Not Governor Clinton, but his camp hired some nasty writers to write all sorts of terrible things about Aaron Burr. And it weakened his political position. First, they accused him of being a philanderer and being the despoiler of young women and all sorts of things like that. When they got tired of that, they accused him of being a homosexual and going after young men. I mean, they just came up with something new every week. And it hurt him. See, so politicians were doing nasty stuff like that even back then. It hurt him. And so by 1804, early in 1804, the Democratic Republicans have their caucus. They didn't have party conventions yet. And they got together to consider who they wanted to run for president in 1804. And they decided, of course, on Jefferson. And then they thought, you know, we don't like these New Yorkers anyway. Especially we don't like Aaron Burr. His position is a little bit weak now. Jefferson wanted to pick a guy to be the next president after he served another 4 years. And he thought if Aaron Burr was the vice president, that Aaron Burr would compete with Jefferson's candidate. So they decided not to pick Aaron Burr to run for vice president. They decided to let Governor Clinton of New York be the vice president because he was old. So he wouldn't run for president. There's no way he'd run for president. Aaron Burr sees this and realizes he's relegated to the scrapyard, after the election anyway. So he decides to run for governor of New York to strengthen his political position. And he's going to lose that election. And he's going to blame Alexander Hamilton for that with some justification. He was whipped pretty badly in that election. It was really embarrassing. And eventually, of course, he and Hamilton are going to duel. And Hamilton will die as a result of that duel, and there's all sorts of stories. You can read 25 different versions of what actually happened. And it's really difficult to prove anything. One of the things was that a lot of the people who were there purposely didn't watch the duel because that way they could testify in court. It was illegal to duel in New Jersey where they dueled. It was illegal to duel in New York too, but the penalties were much higher. So they purposely didn't look at the duel so nobody could witness exactly what happened. They turned their backs on it. And then when the duel was over, they hid Hamilton so that the doctor, not Hamilton, they hid Burr so that the doctor that came to help Hamilton didn't see, could testify he didn't see who shot Hamilton. It's all to cover it up so that it wouldn't go to court. But it's going to ruin Burr for life. It ends his political career. And they indict him for murder, but eventually both states, New York and New Jersey, decide there's no case involved in this. No one will witness. Then they try and fine him for illegal dueling, and they can't even do that. At first he's going to go down to Florida for a quick vacation to get out of the reach of the courts of New Jersey and New York, but they're going to tell him, come on back, we're not going to prosecute you. So he will finish off his presidency, his vice presidency, in the Capitol, in the Senate. And then he's finished forever. We'll start out talking about that next class. That will be next week, right? I've put up a little thing about him. Look at it. When you do your quiz, that doesn't figure in the quiz. But look at it and see if you can answer the question that I pose in there. And if you can write like a page, this is like you're an investigator. Look at what's written there and see if it tells you something that the history book doesn't tell you. By what happens that I describe in there. It's out of the Senate record, so we know for a fact that it's true. But look at that and see if it tells you kind of a different story about Aaron Burr than we get in our little golden book of history. It's kind of an interesting problem. We'll talk about it next class.